Hey, what's up? Welcome back to another video here on Freewell Photos. And today we're going to be talking about, is a raw image better than an HDR, or is an HDR image better than a raw image? And this is really one of those very subjective things, and it really does depend on the subject matter. But I think there are some definitive things that we can really hone in on, and that's what we're going to take our time to hone in on. Now, I'm not inside of On One today. I'm actually inside of Luminar Neo. And the reason for that is because Luminar is a really phenomenal software, and I do use this software in my own personal edits, and I want to bring that more to light in the channel. So I'm going to start branching into other software. I know I say this often, but I do use other programs. But the concept that I'm talking about, it will be the same regardless of if you're using Luminar Neo, Photoshop, Lightroom, Affinity Photo. Doesn't matter, right? The concept that I'm talking about is going to be the exact same. So let's go ahead and jump into Luminar Neo and take a look at what we got going on. So here we are inside of Luminar Neo, and I have my two images. The raw image is over here on the left, and the HDR merged image, or the photo that I combined three separate photos to make this one, is being displayed on the screen now. So this is the HDR image, and this is my raw image straight out of camera. Well, I guess not completely straight out of camera. So let's get into some of the differences. All right. So with the raw image, you can see I have a develop raw module on this particular image, and I went ahead and pulled the highlights down by 100, and I pulled the shadows up by 100. And the reason I did that was to really stress the dynamic range of this particular file. And we're going to do the exact same thing with the HDR to kind of test this. And I should preface this with, this is not like some super rocket science test. This is just me showing you what the left and right limits are of using a single raw file versus using an HDR file. And we'll talk about if you should always shoot in HDR versus just using a raw file as well. What I'm going to do is just straight away show you what happens when I turn on the left and right, or the black and white clipping indicators. So you can see that I'm already overexposing this image, which means I'm losing information. And this is a raw file. I only have this pushed about half of a stop of exposure to the right. And then I have my highlights and my shadows maxed out. So I brought my highlights all the way down as far as I can possibly bring them. And then I pushed my shadows up as far as I could possibly bring them. And if I were to pull up the highlights, you can see I'm just bringing back way more information in this one little area of the image. Now, is that a deal breaker? No, I don't think it is. It just depends on what you're trying to do with the overall file. Well, let's go ahead and pull that down. And then if I pull my shadows down, you can see just how dark this image overall was. So this is why I pulled the shadows all the way up. Now, if I wanted to counteract this, I could sit here and fiddle around, and I can move my exposure around, trying to figure out, what the best way of recalling all of this information. So let's go ahead and pull down on the exposure, because that's the only way that I can recover those highlights. I did photograph this a little overexposed, but I mean, here's what the original looked like. It was underexposed already. And the reason for that is because in the brightest areas, I already had a very bright highlight, and then everything else was not very well lit because I was inside of a building that was relatively dark. And so this is the reason that HDR exists, or at least why I think you should consider using HDR. When the dynamic range, let me just go ahead and reset this real quick and turn this off. When the dynamic range in any one single image is too great in either direction, and when I say either direction, I mean in the shadows, which here, with this photo being exposed as well as I can get it for this light, because if I went any darker on my exposure, then all of this information would have been lost, right? But I was already losing information up here. So what this tells me is I have too much information in my luminance values from the brightest point of the photo to the darkest point of the photo in order to fully expose the image and have balance in the overall photo. It's just extremely contrasty, and it doesn't look very good when I try to photograph it in a single image. But let's go ahead and take a look at what happens when you merge 3 separate images. So now we're taking a look at the HDR image, and this has 3 photos merged together. Now, the cool thing about this is I have a lot of information between my darkest point to my brightest point, and I have some wiggle room. If you look at the histogram here, I have some wiggle room to kind of expose this the way that I need to. So if I turn on my indicators, you can see that, yes, I'm clipping in the shadows, and honestly, areas that are black, I'm okay with clipping those a little bit more, but you can see I still have detail in the brightest areas of the image. And this is the power of HDR, and why I think that more people should probably consider using HDR processing in their workflows. Now, what we're going to do is leave this indicator on. Now, mind you, I did essentially the exact same thing to the HDR version of the image by pulling the highlights all the way down 100 and pulling the shadows all the way up by 100, which I don't recommend that this is what you do to the image, by the way. I'm just doing this for proving a point in the overall editing workflow. And then I also boosted the exposure by half a stop. Now, if I were to pull this up, I can keep going and look at how far I can go, and I still haven't clipped this image, meaning I haven't even hit the brightest point of this image, and I've already gone, essentially, I'm just now starting to clip up here in the little railing up here. So, and that's at 3.4 now. So what does this mean? It means that I have multiple stops of light and I have wiggle room. And this is why I think HDR processing is a good thing to look into for everyone. And the software has made it so much easier for us to create these HDR merges. I don't even think that that's a problem anymore. Just in this one example, this is the primary reason why I would recommend that everyone shoots in HDR, or at least considers shooting in HDR, is when you have a scene that is so drastically different in the tonal variation. Now, let's go ahead and turn off or just remove all of the adjustments there, and we'll turn off our indicators, and I'll turn them back on here in a second. Now, mind you, we're still on the HDR image, and this is what the image looks like when it was merged with all 3 of the exposure values. Now, when I turn on the indicator here, you can see it's still showing up overexposed, but because I have the HDR or the bracketed shots, as I pull down on my highlights, I don't need much recovery, or I don't need to pull too far in order to recover the highlights. And that's, again, the reason why I wanted to showcase this editing technique. And I get it, HDR does have a bad rap. All right. Some people do some very strange things with their HDR images, but I'm recommending that we take an approach that allows us to just get the right balance of exposure in our image, so that way we can edit it properly. Now we've taken a look at the practical use of HDR. And the question that I get asked quite often is, a raw photo better than shooting in HDR, or is HDR better than shooting in RAW? And here's what I would say. You should always shoot in RAW if you are concerned that you're not going to get the tonal range that you're looking for. And if you are shooting in a location that is relatively dim, or there are some variations in the tonal value, it's better to photograph in brackets. And that's a whole different discussion. But if you are familiar with how to capture bracketed images, then I recommend shooting bracketed images. The worst thing that's going to happen if you do this technique is you're going to have 2 to 4 extra images depending on how many brackets you decide to shoot. And that could be a storage issue. So I'm not going to, kind of push over that. But the goal here is really making sure you have all of the information you need to develop the images and to get the photo the way that you want it to look in post-production somewhere, right? What I'm not saying is HDR is going to save you every single time. There have been a number of images that I have photographed and HDR was not going to save me. It just wasn't. But having those extra images available to me and then being able to merge them some way, shape, or form, it's very, very helpful. I have saved a lot of images by doing this exact technique. All right, now before we get out of here, I want to show you one more bonus tip inside of Luminar Neo. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the only software that can do it. So kudos to, and that's actually the other reason why I wanted to showcase HDR processing inside of Luminar Neo. So what I did is I took a single image and I merged that image all by itself. So let's jump back to the catalog really quickly here. I took this image here and I dropped it into the HDR merge and I went ahead and hit merge. And then that spit out this image right here that we're about to take a look at inside of the editing window. And the reason why I did that is because inside of Luminar, I don't know exactly what's going on, not that smart, but essentially you can take a single image and apply all of the HDR properties in a way to a single image. And now we're going to push the luminance values. I'm going to push the shadows up 100%, pull down the highlights 100%, nothing different than what we did earlier. The difference here is watch what happens to the image as I push the exposure. Now we're already well beyond 0.50 and I haven't clipped anything in the highlights yet. Now there's a very small bit of clipping that seemed to be indicated in this area here, but it's actually not there when I let it go and let Luminar render the file. So I can push this pretty far. Now I'm starting to get that clipping warning, and you can see that I guess when I let it go, it just goes away. But one, I would never do this to an image, right? This does not look good. But the point that I was really trying to make with Luminar, and I don't know of any other software that can do this, but you can put a single file into the HDR merge filter, and then you can recover your highlights or your shadows, whatever you need to do. So if you went out and you captured the shot of a lifetime and you only had one image and you were like, I didn't bracket, and now you're missing some of that dynamic range, well, Luminar may be a software that could help you. And that's the reason why I wanted to showcase this particular practice inside of Luminar, because I do that from time to time. Because as much as I say you should bracket, I don't always have my camera set up to do that. And I have captured images where I needed to save the dynamic range. And this tip inside of Luminar Neo has helped me countless times to really keep that image in the running for, being a good file overall as far as the edit goes. If you decide to pick up Luminar Neo and if you purchase the subscription, then you're not going to have a problem, right? You get a subscription, you're going to have access to all of the AI tools, the generative tools, and the HDR merge. However, if you get the lifetime license, the only way that you can get access to the HDR merge is through the annual pass that they have for Luminar Neo. So you will have to purchase an annual pass. Now, if you are purchasing right now for a lifetime license, then you will get access with that purchase for 1 year. I think it's until January 1st of 2026, but be sure to check the website before you make the purchase. You'll get access to all of these tools for 1 year, and then you'll have to re-up on that pass when that expires. But if you want to save some money, either on the lifetime purchase of Luminar Neo or a subscription to Luminar Neo, or if you just need to pick up the annual pass, consider using my affiliate coupon code to save you some money. If you have questions, leave it down in the comment section below. I will do my best to answer them as far as HDR processing or questions that you may have about Luminar Neo. So until next time, I want you guys to stay inspired and keep creating. Peace.